My name is Paul Conway. I serve as Chair of Policy and Global Affairs for the American Association of Kidney Patients. And it's been my honor to co-chair this global summit for the past 6 years with my good friend and ally, Dr. Dominic Raj. On our first session this morning, we're going to be taking a look at an issue that the kidney population knows quite well, the ongoing threat of COVID-19 to those who are immunocompromised and those who are immunosuppressed. This is a very important issue to kidney patients. Kidney patients were one of the most highly impacted populations in the United States and across the globe in terms of mortality and serious illness from COVID. We're still at risk. In March of 2023, when the United States of America declared that it was, quote, a new day, and the emergency declaration on COVID was ended, we were very concerned that the interests of immunosuppressed and immunocompromised patients was never mentioned in any official statement, not the statements from CDC and not the statements from HHS. We took it upon ourselves as a patient advocacy organization to put out a statement in March of 2023 saying it's not a new day for kidney patients who are still at risk. And we have worked diligently with researchers and with industry and with other folks around the nation and around the world to make certain that those concerns of patients that are most vulnerable are still represented. In fact, one of the reasons why Global Summit has done so well and expanded so rapidly was because of COVID and the number of patients who simply are not out in the general population because of their ongoing concern. We respect those concerns. So this morning, one of the first things that we're going to do is introduce you to somebody who's been a real resource for kidney patients and other patients that are severely compromised. Her name is Lisa Glasser, and she serves as the head of vaccines and immune therapies for AstraZeneca. And we'll walk through a series of questions with Lisa and get her sense of where we are currently in terms of developing therapies for patients and the ongoing risk. Again, we understand that this is a serious issue, and we're optimistic that we're moving closer to new therapies. But as a patient population, we must keep raising our voices, and we must keep demanding therapies that can come into the market to keep us safe and help us return to life and the pursuit of our livelihoods, including full-time and part-time jobs, on terms that we define with our employers, not terms that get defined by a disease. So without further ado, Lisa, why don't you go right ahead?
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, AAKP, and thank you, GW, for inviting me, Lisa Glasser, to the Global Summit. I am here on behalf of AstraZeneca. I've had the pleasure of speaking to many of you before. I head up U.S. Medical Affairs in our Vaccines and Immune Therapies unit at AstraZeneca, and I'm really happy to be here today with you. I am going to talk today, as I have before, on the AstraZeneca commitment to vulnerable populations in infectious diseases. This is what I'm going to talk about today. First, our commitment to vulnerable patients, COVID and vulnerable patients. Where are we now? Talk a little bit about supernova and Cipavibart, and just leave you with some final thoughts. AstraZeneca made a commitment to help with COVID during the pandemic. You may recall that we developed a vaccine with Oxford University, which was called Vaxzevria, and was used outside of the United States and protected many millions of people throughout the world. We also developed Evusheld, a long-acting monoclonal antibody, or LAB, as we call it, for prevention of COVID-19 in immunocompromised individuals. And there began our journey and commitment to vulnerable patient populations, immunocompromised individuals in infectious disease. And we have been developing Cipavibart for the same purpose as Evusheld. We also have a pipeline for developing vaccines and antibodies in a complementary way for infections that cause high burdens in vulnerable and immunocompromised persons. And I hope sometime in the future to talk to you more about those. So where are we with COVID in the United States now? The next several slides I'm going to show you have data from the Center for Disease Control, and I've tried in each of these slides to put the link to the web page in case you would like to peruse this information for yourself. Many of you are probably familiar with the COVID data tracker. And in this slide, you can see some information generally over the last week, although some of the data is more like over a 2-week period, on the trends for test positivity, hospitalizations, emergency room visits, and deaths. And there's a lot of information on the slide, but what you can see is that the test positivity rates are increasing over the last week or so. And so are the emergency department visits, and to a similar extent, hospitalizations. One bit of good news is that the deaths are not increasing. Indeed, if anything, they do seem to be decreasing. We'll look in a little bit more detail over the course of essentially October 2023 to now, or roughly the end of June, in the US, looking at hospitalizations associated with COVID-19. And overall, the rate you can see on the title of the slide, about 144 per 100,000 people. I think there are a couple of take-homes from this slide. First of all, that's still a pretty high rate of hospitalization from COVID. You can see that over the course of time from October of 2023, as we headed into the spring and the summer, we were at much lower rates of hospitalization, but you can see now things are starting to, or had started to, tick up again in June as we marched into July. And then looking at the individual curves, the blue curve up at the top is a clear outlier, and that's individuals who are 65 and older. And then the other curves are 50 to 64-year-olds in the sort of charcoal gray. The purple is then the other extreme of life, the youngest babies and kids up to the age of 4. And then 18 to 49-year-olds in the yellow, and then 5 to 17-year-olds in the orange. So you can see that the older adults have a much higher hospitalization burden than anybody else. And nonetheless, the peaks still follow a similar pattern, no matter what age cohort you're in, except for maybe 5 to 17-year-olds who really do seem to be on the whole having much less hospitalization. So despite all of our wish that COVID would just disappear and leave us alone, it's not doing that. And it's not likely to do that. This virus is here to stay. For a little bit of relatively better news, this is the COVID-19 deaths, and you can see that they are flattening compared to earlier in the pandemic. So that's good news. And this is provisional COVID-19 deaths by week, again, from the CDC website. And so you can see we still have peaks. This is not a seasonal virus yet. Maybe it will be at some point. This virus is more coming in waves. And that's what we have seen as a pattern since the pandemic started, and that really hasn't changed. It's the amplitude of the deaths that has declined, which is absolutely good news. We know that in addition to the elderly, immunocompromised persons still have higher risk for more severe COVID outcomes than people who have healthy immune systems. This information on this slide comes from a different CDC website. This is the clinical considerations or interim considerations page focusing specifically on immunocompromised individuals. And in the last MMWR, or Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report on the topic, the CDC published that the updated 2023-24 COVID-19 vaccines reduced the risk of hospitalization by about a third among vaccinated adults who have weakened immune systems. That is less, much less, of a reduced risk of hospitalization than individuals with healthy immune systems get from vaccines, but it is still protection nonetheless, and it is important that people keep up to date with their COVID vaccines. And you can see in the third bullet on this slide, the CDC recommends people with moderately or severely weakened immune systems should get an updated 2023-24 COVID vaccine, and that additional doses may be administered 2 or more months after the last vaccine dose to prevent severe COVID illness. We would encourage everybody to keep up with the CDC recommendations. You can find more detail on the link that's at the fourth bullet point on this slide. There will be an update to the COVID vaccine formulation coming up in the fall. I want to just spend a moment talking to you about the Supernova trial and our high-level results from that. The Supernova study is the pivotal phase 3 trial for the study of our new antibody, Sapavibart, which is designed to provide prevention for COVID-19 for immunocompromised individuals. And this trial enrolled actually just over 3,200 subjects who were randomized 1-to-1 to receive Sapavibart, which was the investigational antibody, in a 300 milligram dose as an intramuscular injection. And then the comparator was initially Evusheld, and then as Evusheld continued to lose potency, FDA asked us to change it to a placebo. So that's why the second blue box shows either Evusheld/placebo. The primary endpoints are listed on the bottom of the slide. Safety, looking at adverse events within 90 days after the dose. And we had a dual primary efficacy endpoint. The first was prevention of symptomatic COVID-19 caused by any SARS-CoV-2 variant. And the second efficacy endpoint was prevention of COVID-19 caused by non-456L containing SARS-CoV-2 variants. And the 456L mutation causes a hit to potency in Sapavibart. This shows you the high-level results from this trial. And I think one thing I really want to point out here is that Supernova was a phase 3 trial of Sapavibart, which is a long-acting antibody. And it met its primary endpoints in preventing COVID-19 in immunocompromised patient populations, which is the only study to this point to have done that. Statistically significant reduction in the incidence of symptomatic COVID-19 compared to the control, whether it was Evusheld or placebo, in an immunocompromised patient population. It met both dual primary endpoints, and Supernova demonstrated the potential benefit of Sapavibart in an evolving variant landscape in which COVID-19 cases were captured over the course of the trial and were caused by several different SARS-CoV-2 variants. This trial was a large phase 3 global trial providing the only efficacy data in the patient population for whom the antibody is to be used, and demonstrated the potential benefit of a COVID-19 antibody in prevention. It's the only efficacy data demonstrating the potential benefit of a COVID-19 antibody in a post-Omicron era. So we continue to work with the FDA to hopefully bring Sapavibart to patients in the US and then also around the world who could benefit. That's really what I wanted to talk about today. Thank you to the AAKP for your partnership. We've worked together in so many ways over the last couple of years. And again, I want to reiterate AstraZeneca's commitment to the patient population. And really, again, thank you so much for the opportunity today.
Thank you very much, Lisa, again, for being with us and for that excellent presentation. So I'd like to move to a few questions with you and do this in rapid fire. Kidney patients and other Americans have heard that it's a new day, and perhaps the threat of COVID is nothing more than the same as the flu. So I was wondering if you could kind of break down for us what is the difference between COVID and the flu, and what's the difference between flu shots and COVID vaccines?
Sure. Without being too much of a nerd, which is hard for me, the common cold is a catch-all phrase. there are a number of different viruses that can cause illness that people will term the common cold. And many of those viruses are circulating at different times of the year. Some of those viruses are actually coronaviruses. And COVID is caused by a coronavirus, but it's not caused by human coronavirus. It's caused by some other novel virus that came from, we're not 100% sure where, but certainly not a human reservoir. And that's what caused the pandemic, because nobody in the world had been exposed to that virus before. So none of us had any protection against it. I think what we're seeing with some of those graphs that I showed you is that because the SARS-CoV-2 or the COVID virus isn't going away, it's bouncing around in a population of humans who are themselves getting repeatedly exposed to it and building immune responses to it from those exposures and from vaccines and other preventive measures that people take. And that builds up a level of immunity in the population that is helpful to us as humans. To the virus, or any virus really, it doesn't care whether it causes a major illness in its host or a minor illness in its host. It isn't to the virus's advantage to kill off all its hosts, otherwise it becomes a dead end. The virus simply wants to access a host, use the host to basically make more copies of itself that can then escape the host and find another host. And in that way, the virus is a success. So the COVID virus, SARS-CoV-2, is quite a success. It roared into our world sometime in probably late 2019 and hadn't gone anywhere, and it's not going anywhere. Now, it's not the same virus as the virus that causes influenza, which is influenza, or some people affectionately call that the flu. The flu virus is a completely different sort of virus. It's not in the same family as coronavirus. It's similar to the coronaviruses in that it changes a lot and does that fairly frequently, and that's why we need to make new flu vaccines every year and be vaccinated annually. So there are some similarities in the way that we approach COVID and influenza, and we use a lot of words in regular language especially that kind of mixes up all of those things, and so that can be very confusing. Typically, colds and the flu come seasonally, fall, winter, and early spring. And as much as people would love COVID to disappear, or at least be able to kind of plunk it into that seasonal framework that we know from the other respiratory viruses, at this point, we haven't quite seen evidence of that. And you could see that in those graphs that I showed you. Over time, could it change? It could change. We just have to watch and see how it goes and do the very best we can to prevent these sorts of infections when there are preventives available. And in the case of COVID and in the case of influenza, we have vaccines that we can take for that purpose. Regular colds, so other human coronaviruses and other viruses like rhinovirus, we don't have vaccines for those. There are other respiratory viruses. You may have heard of RSV, and there are vaccines for that now too for certain populations. And so AstraZeneca has a commitment to public health, and we feel strongly that any opportunity we have, we really like to promote what the CDC is saying and recommendations around prevention of infectious disease. So if you're eligible for RSV vaccines, you should consider being vaccinated as well for that respiratory virus. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks, Doc. And on another issue, can you tell us what you're seeing in terms of how COVID is morphing or the other strains of COVID that are appearing, and what does that practically mean for patients?
Sure. So the virus that causes COVID, SARS-CoV-2, has demonstrated itself to be amazingly resilient and capable of change. And as I described in my answer to the last question, viruses really have a couple of things they need to do. They need to be able to find a host, get inside the host cell, replicate themselves, get out, and find another host. The way that the SARS-CoV-2 does that is by attaching to the human host cell through its spike protein. And it's the spike protein that is used to drive an immune response, a protective immune response with the vaccines. And the spike protein is what monoclonal antibodies that we've used for COVID were built against. So in response to those pressures, the virus mutates and it changes itself. It changes its spike in ways that it tries to change its spike in ways that help it evade the immune responses that its hosts have, but not compromise its ability to enter the host cell and replicate. So it's actually a random process. Virus can't think, but we usually attribute to it tremendous brilliance because it seems to be successful at this effort. And what we have seen throughout the course of the pandemic, initially we saw the wild initial strain, some people call it the Wuhan strain, when the virus first appeared. And then we had the alpha wave and we had Delta. Eventually, the virus has sort of become this multiple-headed Hydra monster where it's so many different variants, but there are certain mutations that have enabled the virus to evade better than others, and those mutations tend to be selected for. The one thing I think we all feel pretty confident about when it comes to this virus and the changes that it undergoes, A, we have no control over it. B, we cannot predict it. So we can monitor it and we can try to make guesses as to what the thing is going to do next, but we really cannot be sure. So the best thing we can do as immunocompromised and otherwise vulnerable populations is to do everything we can to prevent infection, minimize our exposure to high-risk situations. So, for example, if you are going to go to a crowded place, particularly where there isn't good ventilation, you might consider wearing a mask, even though probably nobody else is. And definitely keep up to date on your vaccines and so forth.
Thanks again, Doc. And another question for you that we get asked a lot by patients, which is this. Patients and their caregivers and families are acutely aware of the fact that COVID had a devastating impact on those who are immunocompromised and immunosuppressed. And so from your vantage point today, after several years of going through the pandemic, are you more optimistic now that therapies will be coming online for those who are most immunocompromised and immunosuppressed?
You know, I am optimistic, and part of the reason is, although I don't have any hubris about this virus, so why I'm optimistic is because companies like AstraZeneca and others are committed to meeting and serving the needs of these vulnerable populations. And I know when we put our minds to something and we really try, we usually find a way to succeed. It won't be easy, particularly with COVID, because the virus changes so frequently. that's a real challenge. But, companies are trying. I think scientists and clinicians know this virus isn't going anywhere. So everybody realizes that, we do need to try to make an effort to do something.
Thanks, Doc. From a different perspective, can you tell us how the pharmaceutical industry views high risk populations and how their lived experience and patient insights factor into industry's considerations when developing new products? And for example, at AstraZeneca, how immunocompromised or immunosuppressed patients or kidney patients factor in to your product development?
Well, we've made a concerted effort at AstraZeneca over the course of the pandemic to build relationships with patient advocacy groups among the immunocompromised and otherwise vulnerable populations. So we intend to continue those efforts. We're constantly striving in our clinical trials to increase our enrollment of ethnically diverse, underserved patient communities. And for example, with the Supernova trial, to really try, if at all possible, to study the intervention in the patient population for whom it is intended. I think one thing that's really important to understand with respect to vaccines, it's hard to do your pivotal efficacy study for a vaccine in a patient population who is likely not to mount a robust or adequate response to the vaccine. Because if you don't show that you can generate a robust, adequately protective response to a vaccine, you're not going to get approved by the FDA. So that is just what it is, and it's not inappropriate on the FDA's part. You need to demonstrate that the vaccine works. So generally speaking, you should have the expectation that for vaccines, the trials will be run in individuals who have competent immune systems for that reason. However, AstraZeneca is making a commitment to do the best we can to include enrollment of immunocompromised people in our trials in creative ways and as early as possible, in the development of such preventives. I can't really speak more in detail about that right now, but hopefully would be able to come back later when I am able to talk about that. So, the more dialogue that the pharma company can have with patient groups like AAKP, the more we can be educated to understand how your lived experience, how your outcomes with particular conditions, and even within clinical trial designs to have patient-reported outcomes be part of that. All of that kind of advocacy work that you can do with a pharma company, should be a priority for both the pharma company and you guys. And I will say from AstraZeneca side, we're committed to that.
Thanks, Doc. And we have a final question for you, just in a general sense. Again, based on where we are today versus 4 years ago, for patients that are watching throughout the world, are you more optimistic now than you were 4 years ago, let's say, in terms of better outcomes and better therapies for kidney patients?
Yes, I am. These last 4 years have been crazy. And I've often joked with my colleagues and my team at AstraZeneca about how the pandemic has basically beaten perfectionism out of me, which actually is a really good thing because perfectionism can get in the way of your optimism. So it's not what I would have thought, but actually what we did with this pandemic was we showed that when we put our minds to something and when we work together and when we are collaborative, we can do amazing things. And for that reason, I really am hopeful about the future. I also am hopeful that, we've learned a lot from this pandemic. I'm hopeful that we will retain those lessons as we move forward, and that hopefully we won't have another pandemic in the near term. That might be a lot for any of us to manage, but that we will remember the lessons we learned here, and that we will partner together, and that we will work hard to try to do better and to bring solutions that really work for people. And I really am optimistic that over time this will happen. I wish I could say I'm optimistic it's going to happen very, very quickly. I think in some aspects it may happen fast, and in others we still need to be patient and keep driving for what we know we need.
Thank you very much, Dr. Glasser, for joining the Global Summit again this year and for your ongoing commitment and that of AstraZeneca to working for innovations that can help protect more immunosuppressed and immunocompromised patients that have kidney disease. We deeply, deeply appreciate your investments and your work and research in the arena, trying to keep patients like us safe. For all of those who are watching this session, we understand what you're going through. And for those who are still managing the threats and the fears of COVID, we take them as seriously as you do. And while some might say that there's a new day, we understand that's not true for all kidney patients. That's why we encourage you to join us on social media and join AAKP, because we are really pushing hard to make certain that new therapies enter the marketplace that are safe and that are accessible to all patients, so we can get on with our lives and pursue our livelihoods just like any other American. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you on social media